There are moments when the mind, which we believe to be so stable and in control, suddenly cracks. And from those cracks rise forces that feel greater than ourselves, visions, fears, and impulses that seem to belong not to us but to something vast and ancient. What if these moments of breakdown are not mere failures of the brain, but revelations of a deeper truth about the human psyche? The ego, often regarded as the conscious identity through which an individual navigates the world, is in reality a delicate and limited structure, a small light surrounded by the vastness of the unconscious. It provides order, direction, and a sense of stability. Yet it is not the whole of who we are. To mistake the ego for the entirety of the self is to confuse a single part with the whole, and this misperception is at the root of much psychological suffering. The ego must constantly negotiate with deeper layers of the psyche, forces that are older, more powerful, and often irrational. It exists like a fragile bridge spanning two shores, the visible outer world of daily life and the unseen depths of instinct, memory, and archetypal images. Its strength lies in its ability to balance, but when this balance falters, the individual is pulled into chaos. The fragility of the ego becomes apparent when it overestimates its own authority. In moments of pride, inflation, or over-control, it behaves as if it were sovereign over the psyche, attempting to ignore or repress what lies beneath. Yet the unconscious cannot be silenced indefinitely, for it carries not only repressed wounds, but also creative energies that demand recognition. When the ego resists too strongly or becomes rigid in its structures, cracks begin to appear. A sudden intrusion of unconscious material, whether in dreams, compulsions, or intrusive thoughts, reveals the limitations of the conscious mind. Mental illness can then be understood as the consequence of an ego overwhelmed by what it has refused to acknowledge, its defenses shattered by the weight of neglected truths. The ego's task is survival, adaptation, and consistency, but it cannot survive by standing apart from the whole. To function, it requires a connection with instinctual life and symbolic meaning. When a person identifies exclusively with rational thought, societal expectations, or external achievement, the ego drifts away from these deeper roots. Cut off from nourishment, it becomes brittle, vulnerable to collapse when confronted with life's inevitable crises. Illness, loss, trauma, or even profound inner dissatisfaction may then topple the carefully constructed image of the self, leaving one exposed to psychic forces too great for conscious control. What appears outwardly as depression, anxiety, or disintegration is inwardly the breakdown of an ego that can no longer contain the pressure of unconscious energies. The unconscious does not always emerge violently. Sometimes it erodes the ego gradually. In obsessive patterns, compulsive behaviors, or irrational fears, one sees the slow intrusion of forces that lie outside conscious will. The ego believes it directs life, yet in these moments it becomes evident that something deeper is pulling the strings. This recognition can be terrifying, for it shakes the foundation of personal identity. The realization that one's conscious sense of self is not master but servant, not ruler but fragment, can be the beginning of psychic unraveling. When the ego cannot adjust to this truth, it clings to rigid defenses, and when those defenses break, it collapses into disorder. At times, the ego faces not only repressed personal content, but also collective forces. Archetypal patterns, immense and timeless, rise from the unconscious like storms on the sea. If the ego is poorly anchored, these archetypal waves can engulf it. Delusions of grandeur, persecution complexes, or fragmented personalities often arise when the ego is swept away by such forces. What modern society calls madness may in part be this collapse of the conscious structure, leaving the individual unmoored in a world dominated by images and energies beyond comprehension. Without a symbolic system to mediate these forces, the ego is left defenseless, drowning in currents too vast to master. Yet, even in its fragility, the ego is essential. It is the vessel through which one experiences individuality, meaning, and continuity. Its breakdown is catastrophic, but it also reveals the profound truth that we are more than the conscious mask we wear. Mental illness, when seen through this lens, is not merely dysfunction, but evidence of a deeper struggle between the limited light of consciousness and the boundless depths that surround it. The ego, fragile and finite, stands always on the edge of these depths, and when it forgets its smallness, when it attempts to deny the vastness from which it emerges, the danger of collapse grows inevitable. The unconscious is not a void, but a living reservoir that holds every impulse, every fear, every unexpressed desire that the conscious mind has deemed unacceptable or dangerous. Over the course of life, countless experiences and instincts are suppressed because they do not fit with the image one wishes to project to the world, or because society declares them unworthy of expression. These rejected parts of the self form what is often referred to as the shadow, the hidden counterpart to the conscious identity. While the ego prides itself on control, morality, and rationality, the shadow contains what is raw, instinctual, and often feared. Yet repression does not destroy these forces. It only drives them deeper, where they continue to grow in intensity and wait for an opportunity to emerge. The shadow represents all those qualities that the ego refuses to integrate. It may hold aggression, envy, lust, or shame, but it also contains creativity, passion, and vitality that have been denied expression. Because the ego fears losing its fragile balance, it seeks to lock these elements away, but in doing so it creates an inner pressure that builds relentlessly. Repression functions like a sealed container that is constantly filled, and eventually the walls cannot withstand the weight. When the unconscious erupts under such pressure, the eruption is seldom gentle. It manifests in symptoms that destabilize the ego, anxiety that has no rational cause, depression that drains vitality, sudden compulsions, or intrusive images that haunt the mind. What appears to be mental illness is often the shadow breaking through the barrier of repression, demanding recognition after years of silence. The process of repression creates a division within the psyche. On the surface, the individual appears in control, rational, perhaps even virtuous, but underneath lies a reservoir of forces that contradict this outward mask. This contradiction generates inner conflict, a tension that consumes energy and erodes stability. Over time, the conscious persona becomes increasingly artificial, an empty performance that cannot hide the chaos beneath. The greater the gap between who one appears to be and what one secretly contains, the more violent the eventual collapse. The shadow does not accept permanent exile. It insists on being lived, whether directly through awareness or indirectly through symptoms that force themselves into consciousness. When the shadow finally bursts through repression, it often appears in exaggerated and distorted forms. An individual who has repressed anger may suddenly experience uncontrollable rage or paranoia. One who has denied desire may be overtaken by compulsive fantasies or destructive relationships. In psychosis, the shadow may take on terrifying archetypal imagery, manifesting as persecutors, monsters, or overwhelming voices. These eruptions are not meaningless chaos, but expressions of psychic truths that have long been buried. The more fiercely they were rejected, the more distorted they appear when they finally surface. This explains why mental illness can feel so alien and frightening. The individual is confronted not by something foreign, but by the disowned parts of their own self. It is not only individuals who create shadows, entire cultures do the same. When societies deny instinct, emotion, or spirituality, these forces do not vanish but accumulate in the collective unconscious. The result is collective eruptions, mass hysteria, violence, or ideologies that sweep through populations with the same intensity that repressed impulses overwhelm a single mind. The individual, however, experiences this on a personal level, and without the tools to recognize the shadow, one is at the mercy of its intrusions. Therapy, art, ritual, and symbolic understanding can all serve as bridges to bring shadow material into awareness. Yet when such mediating structures are absent, the confrontation is raw and devastating. The tragedy of repression is that it does not only conceal what is dark, but also what is vital. Many breakdowns occur not merely because destructive impulses have been ignored, but because life-giving energies have been silenced. Passion, creativity, sexuality, and instinct are all natural parts of the psyche, and their rejection leaves the ego sterile and brittle. The unconscious, seeking balance, forces these denied aspects into awareness, even if it shatters the conscious order in doing so. Mental illness in this sense is not only the eruption of the shadow, but also the psyche's attempt to restore wholeness, to compel the ego to acknowledge the fullness of the human condition. The shadow, though frightening, is not merely an enemy. It is a part of the self that demands recognition, and when repression has silenced it too long, its breakthrough becomes inevitable, often carrying the form of psychological suffering. The psyche is not only shaped by personal memories and experiences, but also by forces that are far older and deeper than the individual. These forces are the archetypes, timeless patterns of thought and behavior that belong to the collective inheritance of humanity. They are the great images and energies that have animated myths, religions, and dreams across cultures and eras. Archetypes are not created by the individual mind, but discovered within it, arising spontaneously from the unconscious with a power that transcends rational comprehension. Under ordinary circumstances, the ego manages to maintain a boundary, allowing archetypal material to emerge in symbolic form through imagination, art, ritual, or dream. But when the ego is weakened, overwhelmed, or too rigid, these archetypal contents no longer remain in symbolic distance. They break into consciousness with full force, producing experiences so intense that the individual may lose their sense of orientation in reality. When archetypes invade consciousness, they rarely appear as gentle suggestions. They erupt as overwhelming images, voices, and impulses that carry a quality of sacredness or terror, as though one were confronted by gods or demons. The individual no longer feels master of their own mind. Instead, they are possessed by energies that speak with an authority greater than their own will. Hallucinations, delusions, and profound identity disturbances can all be understood in this light. The person is no longer operating within the narrow boundaries of personal consciousness, but is swept into the storm of collective psychic forces that transcend individuality. What modern psychiatry calls psychosis can be interpreted as such an invasion, where the archetypal flood overwhelms the fragile structures of the ego. The experience of archetypal possession often has a dual quality. On one hand, it is destructive, tearing apart the familiar fabric of daily life, dissolving rational thought, and leaving the individual in terror or confusion. On the other hand, it carries a strange fascination, a sense of encountering ultimate truths or cosmic realities. This is why those who suffer from such experiences often feel they have been touched by something divine or demonic, something beyond ordinary existence. To them, the voices, visions, or overwhelming emotions feel more real than external reality, because they carry the weight of the collective unconscious. The ordinary ego, small and finite, cannot bear such intensity and collapses under the weight of what it cannot integrate. These invasions may take many forms. A person might become identified with the hero archetype, experiencing delusions of grandeur and believing themselves to hold a world-saving mission. Another might be seized by the shadow archetype, overwhelmed with persecutory voices or terrifying visions. Still another may encounter archetypal images of death, rebirth, or divine judgment, leading to intense spiritual experiences that border on madness. In each case, the same dynamic is at play. The unconscious has broken into consciousness not as a whisper, but as a flood, and the ego lacks the symbolic tools to contain or interpret it. In traditional societies, rituals, myths, and spiritual frameworks often provided a structure for these archetypal encounters, allowing individuals to integrate them through initiation or symbolic participation. Modern culture, however, with its emphasis on rationalism and its neglect of symbolic meaning, leaves individuals defenseless. When archetypal forces arise today, they often appear as raw, incomprehensible madness, because there is no cultural container to hold them. Without a myth or symbolic framework, the individual is left alone before the storm, and the psyche collapses into disorder. This explains why so many forms of severe mental illness manifest in imagery that is mythic or religious in tone. Visions of devils, angels, cosmic battles, or world-ending catastrophes. These are not mere inventions of a diseased brain, but eruptions of universal psychic patterns that have lost their symbolic mediation. The archetypal invasion of the psyche reveals that mental illness is not always reducible to chemical imbalance or personal trauma, though these may play their part. It is also the result of a breakdown in the boundary between the conscious ego and the deeper layers of the collective unconscious. When the dam bursts, the ego is flooded by images and energies that are both terrifying and awe-inspiring, leaving the individual adrift between the worlds of myth and reality. What appears outwardly as madness is inwardly the struggle of a fragile ego caught in the grip of timeless forces that transcend individuality, an ordeal that demonstrates the immense power of the unconscious and the precarious balance upon which consciousness always depends. The human psyche is sustained by symbols, for symbols are not merely decorative or imaginative constructions, but vital bridges that connect the conscious mind to the unconscious depths. Without them, the ego cannot navigate the immense energies that lie beneath awareness. Symbols give form to what is otherwise unnameable, transforming the raw power of instinct and archetype into images and meanings that consciousness can comprehend. Dreams, myths, rituals, and even works of art serve this mediating function, providing the ego with a way of encountering the unconscious without being consumed by it. To lose symbols is to lose orientation, to strip consciousness of its compass, leaving the ego exposed to forces that it cannot interpret or assimilate. When this symbolic balance collapses, the individual becomes vulnerable to mental illness, for the psyche has lost its way of communicating with itself. Symbols are not inventions of the rational mind, but spontaneous creations of the unconscious, carrying within them layers of meaning that cannot be fully explained by logic. They emerge in dreams, fantasies, or cultural myths, and they serve as containers for psychic energy. A religious symbol, for example, does not simply represent an abstract concept, but holds within it the energy of collective experience, the accumulated expressions of countless human encounters with the sacred. In personal life, a dream image may hold similar power, pointing the conscious mind toward truths that lie beyond ordinary awareness. When the ego can engage with these symbols, it is able to maintain contact with the deeper layers of the psyche in a way that brings meaning and balance. The breakdown occurs when symbols lose their vitality. In some cases, this happens through cultural disintegration, when the myths and rituals that once guided societies no longer hold authority. Individuals are left without the frameworks that once mediated the unconscious. In modern times, where rationalism dominates and traditional symbols are often dismissed as superstition, the psyche suffers from a symbolic emptiness. The unconscious continues to produce images, but without a living symbolic system to contain them, these images appear in chaotic or pathological form. What might once have been experienced as a sacred vision or initiation can instead appear as hallucination or psychotic delusion. The loss of symbolic mediation means that the ego is faced with raw, unfiltered, unconscious material which it is unequipped to manage. On a personal level, trauma or inner conflict can also shatter symbolic balance. When experiences overwhelm the ego, the individual may lose the capacity to create or sustain meaningful symbols that connect the inner and outer worlds. Dreams become fragmented or nightmarish, imagination turns sterile or frightening, and the individual loses the capacity to find meaning in suffering. Without symbols to translate the unconscious into a language that consciousness can grasp, the psyche is left in a state of division. The ego, deprived of orientation, may attempt to cling desperately to literal explanations or rigid rational frameworks, but this only deepens the split. The unconscious does not vanish. Instead, it invades with disordered images and impulses that appear as symptoms of mental breakdown. The role of symbols in maintaining psychological health is evident when one considers how their absence manifests in illness. Delusions and hallucinations often take the form of distorted archetypal images, stripped of symbolic context. Instead of providing guidance, they overwhelm the ego with terror or confusion. Depression may arise from the absence of meaningful symbols to mediate suffering, leaving life feeling empty and without direction. Anxiety may stem from the unconscious attempting to break through in chaotic ways because no symbolic channel exists for its expression. In each case, the illness is not caused simply by the presence of unconscious material, but by the failure of symbols to provide the necessary bridge between conscious and unconscious. Yet the collapse of symbolic balance is not purely destructive. It is also a signal that the psyche is demanding renewal. When old symbols die, the unconscious pushes forward with new images, seeking to create meaning where none exists. Mental illness, seen from this perspective, is often the crisis of a psyche that can no longer rely on outdated forms of mediation and is struggling to birth new ones. The challenge for the individual is to engage with these emerging images not as literal realities, but as symbols of deeper truths. When successful, this process can lead not only to healing, but to profound transformation, where the ego is reoriented and reconnected to the whole. The danger, however, lies in the failure to recognize the symbolic nature of these experiences, leaving the individual stranded between collapsing old forms and unintegrated new ones, a condition that manifests outwardly as madness, but inwardly reflects the desperate search for renewed meaning. Mental illness, while often perceived only as a collapse, can also be seen as a profound call to transformation. The breakdown of the ego, the intrusion of unconscious forces, and the loss of symbolic balance, though devastating, are not without meaning. They reveal that the psyche is demanding change, urging the individual toward integration of what has been repressed, denied, or neglected. Healing does not come through eradicating these unconscious contents, but through acknowledging them, giving them a place within the totality of the self. The path of integration is therefore not about restoring the ego to its former state, but about reshaping it into a structure that is more resilient, flexible, and attuned to the whole of the psyche. What initially appears as a fall into madness may also contain the seeds of renewal, the possibility of becoming more fully human. The process of healing begins with recognition. One must recognize that the symptoms of illness are not meaningless accidents, but expressions of something deeper within. Depression, anxiety, compulsions, or hallucinations may be frightening, yet they carry messages from the unconscious that the conscious mind has refused to hear. To treat them as enemies to be suppressed is to miss the opportunity they present. Instead, healing requires the courage to listen, to approach these experiences as symbolic, as attempts by the unconscious to communicate. In this light, even the most troubling symptom can be seen as the psyche's way of drawing attention to what the ego has neglected. Integration demands dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. Dreams provide one such pathway, offering images that reveal the direction of psychic movement. Creative expression, through art, writing, or ritual, can serve as another, giving form to inner experiences that would otherwise remain chaotic. Therapy, too, provides a container in which unconscious material can emerge without overwhelming the ego. In each case, the goal is not to destroy the contents of the unconscious, but to translate them into forms the ego can work with. This translation allows energy that was once destructive to become constructive, transforming symptoms into sources of insight and strength. Healing also involves acceptance of paradox. The unconscious does not speak in linear logic, but in images that often appear contradictory or strange. The ego's tendency is to simplify, to divide experience into good and bad, acceptable and unacceptable. But integration requires holding opposites together, recognizing that light and shadow, reason and instinct, order and chaos are all parts of the same whole. When the ego learns to bear this tension without collapsing into one extreme, it becomes capable of transformation. The individual moves beyond rigid identifications and begins to live from a deeper center that can contain the fullness of human experience. The path of integration is not only about personal healing, but also about finding meaning. Suffering without meaning crushes the spirit, but suffering that is understood as part of a larger process can be endured and even embraced. The collapse of the ego, when seen in this light, is the dismantling of a structure that was too narrow to contain the truth of the psyche. What emerges from this collapse is the possibility of a new life, one in which the individual is not merely surviving but participating in the unfolding of a deeper reality. Mental illness, therefore, is not simply a failure, but also an initiation, a passage through chaos that can lead to greater wholeness. Yet this path is not guaranteed. Some remain trapped in the breakdown, unable to integrate what has emerged. For them, the experience becomes only destruction, a descent without renewal. But for others, with the right support, courage, and symbolic understanding, the very forces that once threatened to annihilate them become the sources of new strength. Out of the fragments of a shattered ego, a more authentic self can be formed. One that is no longer built on repression and denial, but on openness to the depths of the psyche. The call of mental illness, then, is not merely a warning of disorder, but an invitation to transformation, to step beyond the limits of the old self and into the possibility of becoming whole. The breakdown of the ego, the eruption of the shadow, the invasion of archetypal forces, and the collapse of symbolic balance are not random accidents, but profound expressions of the psyche's struggle for wholeness. Mental illness, while devastating, reveals that the human mind is not a closed system of rational thought, but a living landscape where consciousness must continually negotiate with the depths of the unconscious. When these depths overwhelm the ego, the result is disorder, but within this disorder lies a hidden invitation to integrate what has been denied, to restore the symbolic bridges that connect us to meaning, and to allow the self to be reshaped into something more complete. What outwardly appears as madness may inwardly be the psyche's desperate attempt to heal itself, to bring to light what has long been buried. To understand mental illness in this way is not to romanticize suffering, but to recognize that even in its darkest forms, the unconscious seeks transformation, and through integration, the fragile ego can be remade into a vessel capable of bearing the fullness of human life.